if you think about uh, you as a customer interacting with any application or tool, we are all very well familiar with the UI or the user experience, right? And we all know intuitively how important it is to have a good UI to really be able to work with something. Can you imagine if ordering an Uber would take you 30 steps to do? No one would like that. You would get very frustrated. You would just pick up your phone and call. You
Indeed.
wouldn't use the Uber app anymore. Uh, Yet, when it comes to development, we sometimes forget that it's the same in that sense.
It's crazy because we are super forgiving with like these legacy applications that we work with
Mhm.
on our own companies. But we wouldn't put it up if it would be like something that you pay for, some sort
Exactly.
of social media app or whatever it is, or even a web page.
Hmm. Right. And if you think about it, in any company, the people are the ones that actually provide the value. When you are working your data team, it's all about how much scope can you handle with your given resource and team. And if you're just spending a lot of time on low value repeated activities, it's a waste of time. So even if you increase the productivity of every per data team by 5 to 10%, that's a lot of additional value that you can be providing back to the company. So to me, it's one of the obvious bottlenecks to think about, right? So
Yeah, indeed. So, very selfishly for the companies, the reason why they should care
mhm.
is because with a better experience, you can actually ultimately turn that into money that you're saving. But I think there are plenty of other reasons to say that if you're listening to this and you're building any type of product, I guess in this case more of a data product, there are still some really good reasons to think about the developer experience. Maybe before I mention the ones that I have in my head, Tony, do you have some others?
Sorry, what was the question specifically?
Yes. What are some good reasons for which product people building data products should care about developer experience?
Well, one was what I just mentioned. It's just the amount of scope a team can handle. And you mentioned reducing costs, but I would not just think about reducing costs at all. It's also about improving value. Because if you think about it,
Yeah.
let's say, I as an engineer have, let's say, 10 or 20 data asks. Let's just give that as a metric here that I need to work on every week. If it takes up all my week, I have no time to like build out new capabilities that could be interesting. Let's say a forecasting model for our accounting department or anything else that would be valuable for the company. Whereas if it takes me half my work week, I can then also build new things. So it's not just about saving costs, but it's also about being able to provide
Yeah.
more value through new development streams.
Indeed.
Um,
The opportunity cost.
yeah, exactly. It's the opportunity cost, right? I think that's the biggest reason to do it. But other reasons could be to kind of streamline the development experience so people have a minimum quality of things they're committing, right? So if you think about this, we do this all the time through CI/CD, right? But we don't think about uh, how do people do this when they're developing, right? So you have control over the process when they push code to the repository. You have control over how it gets merged, how it gets deployed. But then there's this whole like black area in front of it where essentially you don't know what's happening, and at the end they just give you some piece of code, but that doesn't really tell me
No.
anything about whether they uh, did it right or how they went through it. And more often than not, when scope gets really large, it gets very difficult to also confirm everything, right? So if we're thinking about data quality and let's say code quality, things like this, sometimes when teams are really busy, it gets kind of pulled under the rug, right? So what I'm thinking is the more you can automate the correct behavior, the better the overall quality is going to be. And to do that, you have to think about the developer experience. I measure a lot of things. I have a smartwatch, for example.
See?
Yeah, right. So this helps me to measure, my heart rate, my sleep, how many steps I take a day, and that helps me to figure out, am I working towards my goal of becoming more healthy? If I would have to write these things down all manually, I wouldn't do it. It would take too much time, and then that would be disregarded. Same thing with a development experience. The more you can automate these things, the more of them actually get done. If that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. I also happen to have a hot take about it. That is, it doesn't really matter on the why you're doing it, because I firmly believe that the generation that grew up with TikTok and all of these apps, it's really not gonna fly with clunky apps and interfaces. And right now, yeah, of course, the people that started their careers in the 70s or 60s are still the ones making the big decisions of what software to purchase. But maybe I'm going to be wrong. In 20 years, we're going to have this conversation again. But I really think the shift is just going to go because people are not going to be that forgiving as we're right now.
I think it's not really a question about forgiving. It's just a competitive disadvantage for a company. If you're going to spend so much time dealing with a legacy system like that, you have no scope to actually build a competitive edge against your competitors. So you're going to fall on the wayside. Except if if you've been around for a long time and you have a giant moat around your business, that's a different story.
Yeah.
But for new businesses around the block, that's definitely not
Yeah.
a way to go.
It reminds me, very early in my career, I met somebody whose whole job was to jump company to company, updating their SQL servers. And he used to hate Snowflake. But nowadays, I I haven't heard of companies that do like updates anymore, at least manually. It must still happen, but I see it much less.
That makes total sense, right?
Yeah, for sure. So we're really taking away some of that. Maybe let's talk about what are the very specific things a product can have to make your experience better.
Right. I think one of the most important things to think about is what information or contexts does someone need to do their job, and then make it as proximal as possible. So, what do I mean with that? Let's say you have an analytics engineer and they're working a lot with creating DBT models. You want to be able to give them things like their DBT lineage within their code editor. So they can kind of travel around, see the files, see the code, and then see how the lineage updates, maybe get columns from the data warehouse. And of course, anyone that's been working with DBT knows VS Code plugin DBT Power User actually does that. But why I
Yeah.
think that's successful is because it makes it proximal. I don't have to do context switch. I don't have to go to a website or a separate service to see this. So what I'm thinking, and I've had a lot of conversation with people in the data field about this as well, is what is actually the information you need, and how can you make this as proximal as possible to your working environment to improve this experience? Because you think about it, we're context switching all the time, every
Yes.
day, and the less you can do of that, the easier it is to stay focused on what you're doing. So I think that would be one of the guiding principles there. Um,
Yeah, of course, that makes sense. It reminds me of whenever you hit a really big query
mhm,
and it takes, let's say, more than 3 minutes to run.
mhm.
Like in that moment where you have to like disconnect for a second, go get a coffee, like you end up losing some of the concentration, and to a lesser extent, going from one tool to the other one. And sure, you can have like something, the documentation in one monitor and then the tool in the other one, but just having them as closely bundled as possible in the moment that you need them,
Right.
it's really making a huge difference.
And I think companies like Snowflake do this very well. If you look at their UI, you'll see that whenever you run this long query, you'll have your query profile right there available for you to view visually. So you can immediately see, as you have your query, what's happening here, why is this taking so long? And you don't have to like go to a different page, look at the profile, look at the history, right? These are all additional steps, but it's nice to have it there. It makes sense because you typically do this a lot. And the way I usually advise companies to start building something out like this is very simple. First, when you have your data team, you want to have very well managed centralized development environments. And what I typically recommend is using dev containers for this. Um, so in VS Code, you can also use
Yes.
VS Code dev containers for this. And what a dev container is, it's essentially a Docker container. So you have some very basic definitions. You have your Docker file, and you define your container just as normally. But then you also have some JSON configurations for the VS Code server. So what it's doing is it's spinning up a Docker container, and then runs a VS Code server in there that you can connect to then remotely, right? Like through Docker. Um, So
And
it's really powerful because you can configure both the computing environment and the development environment all in one place. And then you can really start to build out a lot of nice features for your team. So you can think about custom linters, you can think about custom code highlighting. This is something I've done with a client of mine where,
interesting.
yeah, so you can, for example, well, your YAML files, uh, you can have a VS Code plugin. I think it was the Red Hat YAML plugin, if I remember correctly. And in there, you can actually define JSON schemas that tell you exactly what the YAML file specification should be. So when I have my YAML file open, it'll just give me a red underline like, hey, you forgot to add a name or a description, or but you can do this uh, uh, much more advanced, right? Depending on what's important for
Yeah,
your company.
the limit is the creativity that you have. And I think that solution, you haven't mentioned this yet, it solves a lot of the problems that you tend to have when you have larger teams, like ensuring that everybody's in the same version of a software
Yes. Yes.
to reduce like compatibility issues. But also like you can pre-mount all of the locations that they need access to, like this part of the data lake, this other part, and that just makes it much easier for them to just work with the data that you expect them to work.